Hey friends, thank you for being here tonight. Whether you're a returning listener or just stumbled in looking for peace and a good story, I'm glad you've joined me. We're heading back to ancient Greece, not for the usual gods and greatest hits, but for the deep cuts, the hidden gems barely visible behind Hercules' abnormally big biceps and Achilles' crowd of simps. You've heard of the legends everyone talks about, but what about the hero who fought a sea monster and still had time to argue with his in-laws? Or the one who saved a whole city and got paid in slightly nicer sandals? These are the stories of the unsung, the bold, the brilliant, and sometimes the bewildered, and I promise they're just as grand, just as moving, and maybe even more human than the names carved into temple walls. Before we begin, if you enjoy what I do, if these tales help you wind down, escape, or just feel a little more connected, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps keep this going, not to mention goodwill from the algorithmic fates. And drop a comment too. Tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is when you join me. I'd love hearing from you, but enough of that. Now take a deep breath, get cozy, listen to the lyre slowly fade into the Aegean, and let these ancient tales carry you into your own journey. You've earned this rest, and I've got a story or two to tell you. If Idas had lived in the modern world, he would probably be the kind of guy who walked into a bar, challenged the strongest guy there to a fight, and walked out with the title of Alpha, all while looking perfectly cool, like he was just passing through. Idas, however, lived in a time where being the strongest guy around didn't just get you a pat on the back, it could get you a reputation, a beautiful wife, and maybe even the attention of a few gods. Born to Arene and Polychaon, Idas was raised in the wild hills of Messenia, where toughness was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. From an early age, it was clear that Idas wasn't going to be the kind of guy who could be bullied into doing anything. He had the kind of natural strength and attitude that could have him holding his own against anyone, and probably even a few gods if it came down to it. But let's not jump ahead of ourselves. Before he became a hero, Idas was just another young warrior, eager to prove his worth. He had the physique, the arrogance, and the ambition of a man who was sure that greatness was his destiny. The gods, however, had other plans. While most mortals would have been content to just live a good life and die with a few decent stories to tell, Idas was destined for much more dramatic tales. Why? Because as with many Greek heroes, love and divine intervention would soon get him into a lot of trouble. Enter Marpessa, a beautiful and fiercely independent woman who would become the focal point of Idas's heart, and of course, his rage. It was love at first sight for Idas, and he quickly decided that she was the one for him. But there was just one tiny problem. Apollo, the god of the sun, also had his eye on Marpessa. Now, while most gods would probably back off once a mortal caught the eye of another god, Apollo wasn't the type to take no for an answer. The Greek gods were known for their lack of restraint when it came to things like love, pride, and throwing mortals into complicated situations. Idas, being a mortal man who didn't particularly care about Apollo's divine status, was not the type to back down from a challenge. When Apollo and Idas found themselves in a standoff over Marpessa, it wasn't just a romantic rivalry. It was a battle for pride, for the heart of a woman, and of course, for the fate of a mortal against a god. Spoiler alert, mortal 1, god 0. Idas won the right to marry Marpessa, and that's when things really started to get complicated. But first, let's take a look at his rise to prominence, and how he became the kind of hero whose name would be written in the myths, but not exactly for all the right reasons. After winning Marpessa's hand from Apollo, Idas became not just a hero of Messenia, but also a name whispered across Greece. It was the sort of victory that would make most men puff out their chests and strut around, claiming their place in the world, but for Idas, it was just the beginning. He wasn't just a man who had outwitted a god, he was a man whose future was as wild and unpredictable as the gods themselves. With Marpessa by his side, Idas grew more determined than ever to prove his worth. He became known for his feats in battle, and his reputation spread like wildfire across Greece. His greatest skill, aside from being able to outmuscle just about anyone in his path, was his ability to outsmart the very gods who had once tormented him. No longer content to be just another footnote in Greek myth, he began to seek out challenges that would cement his name in the chronicles of Greek heroism. Idas became a hero of notable deeds. He helped lead the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece, proving his mettle on a team of legendary figures. The gods had given him no easy path. Jason, the leader of the Argonauts, was a noble enough figure, but he wasn't exactly known for his physical prowess. That's where Idas came in. He didn't just provide muscle, he led his men with cunning, fearlessness, and a sense of determination that made him invaluable to the mission. The Argonauts encountered all sorts of dangers, giant clashing rocks, deadly monsters, and of course the ever-present meddling of the gods. But despite all the divine interference, Idas was always a step ahead. When the going got tough, he took charge, using his strength and sharp mind to outmaneuver their enemies. His bravery on the journey was undeniable, and even the gods who had once mocked him couldn't help but respect him. They were, after all, in the business of testing mortals, and Idas passed with flying colours. Yet, as is always the case with heroes whose pride matches their strength, Idas's actions began to reflect his growing arrogance. Despite the immense respect he commanded, he started to believe that he could take on any god or any challenge without consequences. He had won the love of Marpessa from Apollo, after all. Surely he was invincible. This overconfidence, though, would soon prove to be his undoing. During one of their quests, Idas and the Argonauts found themselves facing the savage giant Antaeus, a beast who was known for his immense strength. Unlike most warriors, Antaeus derived his power from the earth itself. Each time he fell, he was able to rise again by touching the ground. Idas, never one to shy away from a fight, was determined to defeat the giant, but he had a plan. His first mistake was thinking that a quick physical win was all that was required to defeat the giant. And Antaeus, who was certainly no amateur when it came to battle, was far from being just another foe. Despite his arrogance, Idas did manage to outsmart Antaeus, but not without significant consequences. His victory was hard-earned and ultimately soured by a chain of events that led him to realize that the gods never fully let go of their pawns. He had managed to kill the giant, but in doing so, he unwittingly angered Hercules, who had once shared a bitter rivalry with the giant, believing that Idas had stolen his glory. Idas, who had once believed that he could do no wrong, found himself entangled in the divine games yet again. Though he was celebrated as a hero by the Argonauts and was praised for his strength and cunning, the gods looked on with amusement, knowing all too well that no mortal, especially one as prideful as Idas, was immune to their whims. By now, Idas had earned a reputation as one of the fiercest warriors in Greece. The Argonauts knew him as a leader, someone whose strength could turn the tide of battle, and even the gods, with all their power and might, had come to view him as a threat. It was clear to Idas that no one could match him, not even the gods. He had already bested Apollo, taken on Antaeus, and shown that his courage knew no limits. The more victories he earned, the more convinced he became that his fate was his own to control, that no god could decide his path but him. But there is a saying in Greek myth that the gods always have the last laugh, and, as it turned out, Zeus was about to have a good chuckle at Idas's expense. It all started when Idas and Marpessa were travelling in the lands of Macedonia. There, the couple encountered a powerful oracle, a seer who claimed that the gods would soon test their love and Idas's true strength. Naturally, being the bold, confident man he was, Idas brushed off the oracle's warning. What do gods know of love, he thought. What do they know of me? If the gods were going to test him, he was more than ready to face them head on. The test came sooner than he expected. While Idas and Marpessa were enjoying a rare moment of peace by a riverbank, a bolt of divine fury struck the earth. Zeus, in his infinite and often cruel wisdom, had decided that Idas's confidence had crossed the line into hubris, and it was time for him to face a divine reckoning. Without warning, Zeus sent a storm of lightning bolts to the skies, and Hermes appeared in a flash of light. The messenger god was tasked with delivering a message that would mark the beginning of Idas's downfall. "Idas," said Hermes, his voice tinged with divine authority, "you may have bested the gods once, but that arrogance will be your undoing. The gods will not tolerate this disrespect. The challenge now is not a matter of battle, but of spirit." With those words, Hermes vanished, leaving Idas shaken and confused. The storm that raged around him seemed to grow fiercer, and in a terrifying instant, Marpessa was swept away by the divine winds, her figure vanishing into the distance. Idas, in his fury and desperation, raced after her, determined to save her. But as he crossed into the mountains, he soon realized that the more he tried to catch up, the farther away she seemed. No matter how fast he ran, Marpessa remained just out of reach, as if the gods themselves were pulling her away. The winds howled louder, and Idas's exhaustion grew with each step. Finally, as he stumbled across a rocky precipice, a familiar voice rang out. "You cannot outrun fate, Idas," a cold voice called out from behind him. It was Apollo, the very god who had once loved Marpessa, who had now come to remind Idas of his place. "You believed that you could fight the gods," Apollo continued, his voice echoing with divine power, "but no mortal can ever outrun their own destiny. Your pride led you to this moment, and now it shall be your undoing." Idas, his legs heavy with the weight of the divine curse, collapsed to the ground, realizing the true nature of his error. The gods had granted him strength, yes, but they had also twisted that strength into arrogance. His challenge to them had been his own doing, and now the consequences were clear. Marpessa was lost to him, and his own fate had been sealed. The winds had died down, and the sky was clear. Idas was left alone in the quiet aftermath of the god's wrath, standing amidst the barren hills of Macedonia. He had always believed that his strength, his skill, and his will could overcome anything. He had grown up in a world where only the strongest survived, where power was everything. He had led the charge for the Argonauts, faced monsters, defied the gods, and come out victorious. But now, all of that seemed meaningless. The gods had reminded him of his place, and there was no victory to claim, only a hollow defeat. His heart felt as though it was being squeezed from all sides. The anger that had driven him in battle, the pride that had made him who he was, all now seemed like chains weighing him down. He could no longer look at the world through the eyes of a warrior who saw only glory and triumph. His perception had been shattered. "What was it all for?" he whispered into the silence. His voice barely carried above the sound of his ragged breathing. He had fought for Marpessa, had stolen her away from Apollo, and won her heart. He had thought, in his arrogance, that nothing could stand in his way. But now, she was gone. Not to another man, but to the whims of fate itself. The gods, as always, had played their part. Apollo, the god of the sun, the very one who had once loved Marpessa, had intervened with his divine power, and Idas's victory was turned into a bitter loss. He had won her hand in the mortal world, but in the divine realm he was just a man, a plaything in the gods' eternal game. He had no control over her fate, and now she was lost to him forever. The gods had swept her away, just as they had swept away his glory, his reputation, and everything he thought he had earned. He felt a pang of despair so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. Marpessa, the woman he had fought for with all his might, had disappeared as though she had never existed. His love for her, once so strong and unshakable, now felt like a distant memory, lost in the fog of divine intervention. What was love if it could be stolen away with a mere word from a god? What was the point of fighting for something if it could be taken away without warning? As Idas wandered through the hills, the once proud warrior was now a shadow of his former self. His thoughts spiraled into despair. What was I supposed to do? He asked aloud. But the mountains only echoed back his own pain. I loved her. I fought for her. But none of it matters. His mind raced, unable to find any answers. He could no longer blame the gods for his situation. The truth was that he had been blinded by his pride and his belief that he could control everything. He had always been so sure of himself, so certain of his place in the world. But the gods had shattered that illusion, and now he had nothing. He could still feel the weight of the guilt hanging over him like a thick fog. He had killed Antaeus, the giant, and in doing so had inadvertently provoked Hercules, who had considered it his own battle to finish. He had killed others along the way, thinking that his strength would earn him respect, but he had never once stopped to consider the moral cost of his actions. His victories had come at a steep price, but now that the war was over, the victories seemed hollow. He had won battles, but lost himself, and now he was left alone to wrestle with the consequences. The pain was overwhelming. Idas wanted to scream, to lash out at the gods, to demand they give him what he thought was rightfully his love, his honor, his pride. But he knew deep down that no matter how much he raged, no matter how much he fought, there would be no changing what had been done. Marpessa was gone. The gods had made sure of that, and no amount of strength or fury could bring her back. As the days passed and the weight of his guilt sank deeper into his soul, Idas was left with a choice. He could continue to fight the gods, continue to rage against fate, but he knew in his heart that it would be a fruitless endeavour. Or he could accept his fate, recognise that he had been humbled by forces beyond his control, and seek redemption in the only way he knew how, by owning his mistakes. But could he do that? Could a man who had been so proud ever truly accept the weight of his own flaws? "What is left for me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling of the trees. "The gods will never forgive me. I have nothing left to fight for." The reality hit him with full force. He had lost not just Marpessa, but his own sense of self. The man who had once stood proudly among the greatest of heroes was now just a broken figure, wandering through the mountains with nothing but his regret and his shame. In the silence of the hills, Idas realised that the only way forward was through acceptance. He would never regain the love he had lost. He would never be the man he once was. But if he could learn to live with his mistakes, to accept his limitations, perhaps there was a sliver of peace waiting for him. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to make amends for the suffering he had caused. The days that followed the storm of divine retribution were a blur for Idas. Each step he took through the desolate hills felt heavier, as if the very earth beneath him was pushing him down. The once confident, powerful man who had proudly stood among the Argonauts was now a shell of himself, broken, defeated, and consumed by a despair so deep that it seemed to swallow all hope. His love for Marpessa had been the driving force behind his actions, his quest for glory, and his belief that he could control his own destiny. But now she was lost to him, not because of a rival lover or a superior warrior, but because of forces far beyond his comprehension. The gods, with their petty games and cruel whims, had taken everything from him. His victory over Apollo, his strength in battle, his pride, all of it had amounted to nothing in the face of fate. He had defied the gods, and they had repaid him with a lesson in humility that he would never forget. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him with every passing moment. He had murdered those who had trusted him, people who had once fought at his side. Antaeus, the giant, was dead at his hand, and while he had thought his victory was one of glory, it had only led to conflict with Hercules, and further consequences with the gods. His reputation, once built on his strength and cunning, had now been irreparably tarnished. The realization gnawed at him like a hunger he couldn't satisfy. Nothing he did would ever be enough to undo his mistakes. The gods had stripped him of his pride, his love, and his honor. He could fight on, continuing to rage against fate, but he knew now that it would be futile. He had been humbled by the gods, and he had learned the hard way that no matter how strong a man was, he could not escape their will. In the silence of the mountains, Idas sat alone, staring at the horizon. The land stretched out before him, barren and empty, just like the future he had once imagined for himself. Marpessa's absence felt like a wound that would never heal, and he couldn't escape the thought that he had caused her suffering as well. He had won her from Apollo, but in doing so he had made a bargain with the gods that had brought ruin upon them both. For hours Idas sat there, his mind racing, until finally, the only thing he could think to do was return to Messenia. He had been a great warrior, a hero in the eyes of the Greeks, but now he felt nothing but the hollow weight of his own mistakes. The people who had once looked up to him as a hero would now see him as a cautionary tale, a man undone by his own arrogance. His name, which had been spoken with pride in the halls of Sparta, would now be remembered only for the mistake that had cost him everything. But even as he resolved to return, Idas knew he could not simply live with this shame. There was no redemption in the world that could fix what had been done, no journey that could undo the damage caused by his actions. He had lost Marpessa, and the love they shared would never be reclaimed. The thought of facing his fellow warriors, of being forced to confront what he had done, terrified him. He was a man who had once believed that strength could solve everything, but now strength felt like his greatest weakness. He was no longer the man who could take on gods or slay giants. He was just a man, a broken one, walking through a world that would never see him the same way again. Finally, after days of wandering, Idas found himself on a cliff overlooking the sea, the wind whipping at his face. Marpessa's face seemed to appear before him in the swirling winds, a constant reminder of the love he had lost and the pain he had caused. The gods had played their hand, and he had been the pawn in their game, but he could not accept the fact that his journey had come to this end. No victory, no triumph, no battle would ever undo what had been taken from him. He realized, with quiet clarity, that his only remaining option was to end it. He could no longer face the weight of his actions, nor could he bear the thought of living in a world where Marpessa was lost to him forever. The guilt, the pride, and the humiliation had shattered him in a way that no external battle ever could. Idas had been a great warrior, but this was his final, most painful battle, accepting the fact that he had lost it all. As Idas knelt on the precipice, sword in hand, ready to end his pain, a strange thing happened. The wind stilled, the world quieted, and for a fleeting moment he could feel a presence that was not his own. It was as if the gods themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make his final decision. He paused, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over him, as if the storm inside him had finally calmed. Perhaps. This is my fate, he whispered, but at least I will meet it on my own terms. With a final tragic decision, Idas ended his life, the sword plunging into his heart, and with it, the hope of any redemption. As the echoes of Idas's death faded into the quiet of the mountains, his legacy was sealed, not with the glory of battle, nor with the triumphs of a victorious hero, but with the tragic and painful consequences of his own pride. The gods who had so eagerly tested him had finally shown him the true weight of his defiance. After his death, Idas's name lived on, but not in the way he might have hoped. The tales of his strength, his daring feats on the battlefield, and his victory over Apollo were still told by the bards, but they carried an undercurrent of tragedy. No longer was he remembered as the hero who had fought valiantly for the Golden Fleece or the brave warrior of the Argonauts. Instead, his story became a warning, a stark reminder that even the greatest heroes could be undone by their own arrogance. The Greek soldiers who had once stood by Idas now looked at his memory with a mixture of awe and sorrow. How could the man who had so boldly taken on the gods have fallen so tragically? How could someone with such immense strength and courage have been destroyed by the very pride that had made him who he was? The answer, of course, was simple: hubris. Idas had believed that he was invincible, that no god could stand in his way, and in the end it was his arrogance that brought him to ruin. His story became a tale for mothers to tell their sons, a tragic myth woven into the fabric of Greek culture, one that emphasized the importance of humility in the face of divine power. In Messenia, where Idas had been born and raised, his death was mourned quietly. The people of his homeland had lost one of their greatest warriors, but they knew that his story was no longer one to be celebrated. Idas, despite his valor, was a man who had been consumed by his own pride and had lost everything because of it. His name would not be etched on monuments of victory or sung in the halls of honor. Instead, he would be remembered as a tragic figure, one whose downfall was inevitable because he could not reconcile his pride with the will of the gods. Even Marpessa, the woman for whom he had fought so fiercely, could not escape the shadow of Idas's legacy. While her love for him had once been genuine, she could not deny the pain of his mistakes, the pain of losing him to his own folly. Idas had been the man she loved, but he was also the man who had destroyed himself with his own hands. She would forever be linked to his story, not as the woman who had been swept away by love, but as the woman who had been caught in a tragic dance with fate, a woman who had loved a man who had ultimately lost his way. The gods, ever watchful, did not feel pity for Idas. Zeus, who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless mortals, saw in Idas the classic example of how pride could bring even the strongest to their knees. He had no sympathy for those who defied him, but even he could not ignore the lessons that Idas's story left behind. It was a reminder to all mortals that no matter how great they might be, they were always at the mercy of the gods. And for Idas, who had spent his life challenging fate, his legacy became a tragic symbol of how the greatest hero could fall when he underestimated the power of divine will. In the quiet aftermath of Idas's death, his story became a legend, not the kind that inspires songs of glory and heroism, but one that rings with a painful, cautionary tone. His name, though spoken in the halls of heroes, was no longer one to be revered with the same admiration as the likes of Achilles or Heracles. Instead, Idas was remembered for a far more complex reason: his tragic fall, his prideful defiance, and the price he paid for his arrogance. For the Greek world, Idas became a symbol of the dangers of hubris, the fatal flaw that had led so many heroes to their doom. Unlike other heroes whose lives were marked by grand victories and heroic deeds, Idas's story ended not with glory but with regret, a lesson learned too late. His legacy was one of tragedy, showing that even the mightiest warriors could fall, not because they were defeated by enemies or gods in open battle, but because they refused to see the forces beyond their control. Over time, his tale spread across the land, but it was never told in the same reverent tone reserved for those who had earned true honour. Instead, Idas's story was often shared as a warning to young warriors and ambitious men. Do not let your pride blind you to your own limitations. Even the gods can humble the strongest of men. Idas, with all his strength and valour, had come to embody the cost of ignoring divine will, an important reminder that no mortal, no matter how powerful, was exempt from the gods' judgment. In the lands of Messenia, where Idas was born, his story was woven into the very fabric of the region's identity. His tragic fate resonated deeply with the people of his homeland, who had once been so proud of his heroic deeds. But even there, the tale of Idas was no longer one of inspiration. It was a tale of humility. The people honoured the memory of his strength, but they also understood the lesson his life imparted. Strength alone is not enough to conquer fate, and in his death, Idas taught them the true meaning of pride and humility. For Marpessa, the woman for whom Idas had once fought so fiercely, the pain of his loss remained with her for the rest of her days. Though she had loved him deeply, his fate had been sealed by his own actions. The gods had intervened in their love, and Marpessa, in her own quiet sorrow, realised that she too had been a victim of fate's cruel game. Her love for Idas would never fade, but she would spend her days living with the understanding that sometimes love alone cannot overcome the forces of the gods. And so, Idas was remembered as a tragic hero, a man who had the strength to defeat armies, the courage to challenge gods, and the determination to fight for love. But ultimately he could not fight the inevitable consequences of his own pride. His name lived on, not in the songs of glorious victory, but in the whispered warnings of the elders, passed down to the next generation of heroes who would learn from his mistakes. In the grand scope of Greek mythology, Idas's place was not among the great and unchallenged heroes, but among those who had failed to heed the lessons that all warriors must learn. That true strength comes not just from power, but from knowing when to bow before the will of the gods and when to accept the limits of one's own mortal nature. There's a saying in ancient Greece that goes something like this: the winds of fate blow for everyone, but for some they come with a bit more flair. And if anyone embodied this idea, it was Zetes, the son of Boreas, the mighty north wind. You see, while most heroes had to rely on their strength, wits, or weapons to stand out, Zetes had something a little more windy: the ability to fly. Yes, you heard that correctly. He could actually fly, and not just like those dainty, half-hearted attempts we see in mythological stories with poorly drawn wings. Zetes had wings like the north wind itself, strong, fast, and a bit of a show-off. Imagine being the kind of guy who could show up to a battle, swoop in, and swoosh past your enemies faster than they could blink. Zetes and his brother Calais, who shared his divine heritage, were the ultimate air force of their time. These two winged wonders didn't need horses or chariots to travel. They just spread their wings and whoosh, off they went, faster than any mortal could follow. But let's be real. Being the sons of a god of the north wind has its ups and downs. On the upside, flying like a bird is super cool, and really handy when you need to escape a sticky situation. On the downside, though, you have absolutely no control over how fast you can go. Zetes, who was used to moving faster than a chariot race on steroids, often found himself in situations where he accidentally left people behind, or blasted through things with the force of a storm. Imagine being so fast that even your friends can't keep up. Awkward, right? Still, this high-speed lifestyle didn't slow Zetes down one bit. As the son of Boreas, he was also naturally strong and fierce, a deadly combination. He wasn't just fast, he was tough. He'd grown up in the mountains of Thrace, where the winds were often as cold as his temper. And that fiery, stormy nature came in handy when he was chosen to join the legendary crew of the Argonauts, led by none other than Jason, the man with the golden fleece obsession. When Jason called upon the bravest of Greece to help him obtain the golden fleece, Zetes and his brother Calais couldn't resist the allure of another grand adventure. Flying to distant lands, fighting monsters, outrunning gods, count them in. What Zetes and Calais didn't quite expect, however, was just how much trouble their incredible speed would bring. The thing about flying super fast is that you sometimes miss a lot of the details. You might zoom past something important, or in the case of Zetes, you might accidentally offend a few deities. And while the gods might be okay with the occasional mortal offending them, because, let's face it, it happens daily, Zetes didn't quite learn early on that when you're faster than the north wind, you might step on a few divine toes along the way. But Zetes wasn't the kind of guy to back down from a challenge, especially when the reward was a golden fleece and eternal fame. Along with his brother Calais, who was just as speed-crazed as him, Zetes would eventually face trials that tested not only his speed and strength, but also the limits of his impulsive nature. And thus, armed with his wings and the gift of speed, Zetes was ready to dive headfirst into the world of gods, monsters, and of course, a quest for a golden fleece that was way cooler than anything any mortal could ever hope to achieve. But little did he know, some of the creatures they'd face were about to learn firsthand that messing with the sons of Boreas was a lot like messing with the tornado. It wasn't a good idea. As the Argonauts set sail on their quest for the Golden Fleece, Zetes and his brother Calais quickly became indispensable members of the team. Not just because they could fly, but because of the way their speed gave the Argonauts a significant edge over both natural and supernatural threats. They were the Argonauts' scouts, always able to outrun danger and reach places no one else could. At the beginning of the journey, when the Argo was still adjusting to the unfamiliar seas and the pressure of the quest, Zetes and Calais took to the skies, scouting ahead to ensure the safety of the crew. It wasn't long before Zetes found himself having a bit of fun with his newfound freedom. Flying over forests, mountains and valleys, he would swoop down with the wind at his back, showing off for the crew below. His light-hearted antics were met with chuckles from his fellow Argonauts, who marvelled at the sight of the brothers soaring through the sky, their wings gleaming in the sun. However, not all of Zetes' flights were as carefree as he might have liked. With great speed comes great responsibility, and it didn't take long for Zetes to realise that there were dangers on the horizon, literal and figurative, that he couldn't simply outrun. The first significant challenge came when the Argonauts reached the island of Phineus, the blind prophet. Phineus had been cursed by the gods, tormented by the Harpies, hideous winged creatures sent to plague him. The Harpies would steal Phineus's food and torment him, leaving him unable to live in peace. It was Zetes and Calais, with their speed and wings, who were tasked with helping the prophet. When they arrived on Phineus's island, the Harpies were there, swooping down to steal the prophet's food as always. Zetes, with his quick reflexes and ability to fly, was perfectly suited for this task. As the Harpies descended, he and his brother dove into action, flying circles around the creatures, cutting off their escape routes and driving them away. Zetes, full of youthful energy, couldn't help but enjoy the chase, weaving and dodging through the skies as the Harpies screeched in frustration. It was like a high-speed chase, but with monsters. The Harpies, unable to keep up with the brothers' speed, were forced to flee, leaving Phineus free from his torment. His gratitude was immense, but Zetes, still flying circles around the island in celebration, had to be reminded that the Harpies weren't gone for good. They would be back. "Next time, let's not leave them a chance to regroup," Zetes said with a grin. He was, after all, a creature of speed and action, not always one to consider the long-term consequences. It was in moments like these that Zetes' impulsive nature got the best of him. He could see the immediate benefit of acting fast, but often failed to realise that the long-term impact of his actions needed more thought. His giddy enthusiasm often led him into situations where his power was an asset, but it also made him prone to leaving things half done, or letting his speed get ahead of his better judgment. Despite his sometimes reckless behaviour, Zetes continued to be a vital asset to the Argonauts. His ability to fly helped the group evade numerous dangers, and when it came to situations that required speed and precision, Zetes was the first to be called upon. But the gods, as always, had their own plans, and while Zetes believed that his speed and wings would always be enough to keep him ahead of the game, he would soon discover that even the fastest hero couldn't outrun fate forever. The quest for the Golden Fleece had brought the Argonauts to the edge of the world, with many dangers still ahead. After dealing with the Harpies, the crew had grown more confident, knowing that the gods and monsters they faced could be overcome with speed, strength, and strategy. But even Zeitz, with his extraordinary gift of flight, was starting to realise that there were forces in the world that no one could outrun, not even the mighty sons of Boreas. The first signs that Zeitz's speed might not be enough came when the Argonauts reached the shores of Colchis, the land where the Golden Fleece was kept. The city was heavily guarded, both by Ares's dragon and by a series of divine and mortal challenges designed to test anyone who sought the fleece. Jason had come with a plan, relying on Medea's magic and the strength of his warriors, but Zeitz, ever the optimist, believed that their most pressing problem was the dragon. Surely, he thought, no creature could match his speed. But the dragon was a different kind of enemy, one that wasn't so easily outflown. Zetz, in his typical impulsive style, decided to fly ahead to scout the dragon's position before the Argonauts attempted to steal the Golden Fleece. He zoomed through the skies, his wings cutting through the air like a streak of lightning. He could see the dragon guarding the fleece, its massive serpentine body coiled around the tree, its eyes glowing like molten gold. But Zetus's speed got the better of him. He moved so fast that he barely noticed the sudden shift in the wind, a sign that the gods were intervening once again. Zeus, ever fond of setting mortals on paths of trials, had decided that Zeitz needed a lesson in humility. As Zeitz dove low to inspect the dragon, the winds shifted, and what seemed like an open, unguarded position turned into a trap. The dragon, sensing the disturbance in the air, hissed and reared back, launching a sudden strike. Zeitz, flying at breakneck speed, wasn't prepared for this shift in momentum. He narrowly dodged the dragon's attack, but in doing so, he collided with a mystical barrier, one of the divine traps set by Aethys, the king of Colchis. "Wait, you didn't see that coming?" Steers muttered to himself, a bit too flustered to think clearly. He had zoomed right into it, thinking his speed would be enough to avoid all dangers. But now, with the dragon's roar echoing through the air, Zeitz found himself unable to outfly the situation. The dragon had been roused, and now it was time for the Argonauts to fight, not run. As the Argonauts charged forward, Jason and Medea leading the charge, Zeitz realized that his impulsive speed was not always the solution to their problems. He had been so used to running ahead of everyone that he had forgotten to account for the larger picture. The dragon, despite being an enemy of incredible power, could be overcome with the right strategy, but not with brute force or speed alone. "I should have waited," Zeitz muttered to himself, realizing that while flying at lightning speed had its advantages, it was also a dangerous approach when dealing with enemies who didn't just rely on physical power. Sometimes the key to success wasn't about getting there first, but strategizing with your team and adapting to the challenges ahead. But Zeit's realization came too late for him to undo the damage. The dragon had already sensed the presence of the Argonauts, and was now on full alert. Zetes was able to use his flight to distract the creature and draw its attention away from Jason, but the battle that followed proved that no one was invincible. Even his unmatched speed couldn't save him from the fury of a creature protected by divine magic. The Argonauts had to fight as a unit, using their combined strength and strategy to subdue the dragon. When the dust finally settled, Zetes found himself nursing a bruised ego and a newly sharpened sense of humility. The gods, he realized, didn't like it when mortals thought they could outsmart fate with their speed and power. There were trials ahead that couldn't be avoided by simply flying faster than everyone else. His impulsive nature had brought him face to face with the consequences of thinking too highly of his own abilities, and now, more than ever, he understood that sometimes the greatest heroes were those who learned when to slow down and think. After the encounter with the dragon, and the realization that his impulsive nature had nearly undone their chances of success, Zetes found himself in an unfamiliar position, doubting his own abilities. For much of his life, his speed had been his greatest asset. Flying faster than anyone had always been enough to solve problems, but now, with the Golden Fleece within reach, Zetes understood that there were challenges in this world that even his wings couldn't help him conquer. As the Argonauts made their way through the labyrinthine temple of Ares, preparing for the final attempt to retrieve the Golden Fleece, Zetes began to reflect on his journey and the mistakes he had made. He had always been the one to act first, often charging headfirst into danger without thinking of the consequences. His ability to fly had made him feel invincible, but now, in the face of divine trials, he could see that brute force and speed weren't enough to guarantee victory. His mind raced with self-doubt as he watched the other Argonauts prepare for what would be their final battle. Jason, calm and determined, was strategizing with Medea on how they would confront the dragon, using her magic and his leadership to make the best of the situation. Heracles, ever the warrior, was sharpening his weapons, ready to engage in physical combat. Meanwhile, Orpheus played his lyre softly, his music calming the tension in the air. Each of the Argonauts had their own role to play, and Zets began to wonder where he fit into all of this. As the group settled into their positions, preparing for the confrontation with the dragon, Zetes stepped away from the others, seeking some solitude. He took to the skies, hovering above the camp, the wind rushing through his feathers. As he soared higher, his thoughts became more chaotic, his doubts swirling like the winds he controlled. I was so sure of myself, he thought. I thought I could solve everything just by flying faster, by being the quickest. But what if speed isn't the answer? What if it's more about patience, strategy, and the ability to think rather than just move? He looked down at the Argonauts below. They were preparing to face the dragon, a creature that even Heracles couldn't easily defeat. The fleece was guarded by not just physical strength, but divine power. Zetes knew he couldn't rely solely on his ability to fly. He needed to be part of the team, to support Jason, Medea, and the others in ways that went beyond just rushing in. In that moment, he made a decision. He would change his approach. Instead of flying off to face the danger alone, he would work with the group, using his abilities in a way that complemented their strengths. Zetes realized that sometimes, even the greatest of heroes had to adapt, to recognize that speed and strength alone wouldn't win the day. It was about working together, respecting each person's role in the larger picture. When the time came for the final confrontation with the dragon, Zetes was no longer the reckless speedster who had rushed into battle with little thought. This time, he used his ability to fly to distract the dragon, weaving around it with precision, guiding its attention away from Jason and Medea. His wings became the perfect tool for creating openings and providing the team with opportunities. Zetes didn't need to outrun the dragon or defeat it himself. Instead, he was there to make sure the team had the best chance to succeed, working in tandem with the others. With the help of Medea's magic and Jason's strategy, the dragon was finally defeated, and the Golden Fleece was within their grasp. As Zetes landed back beside his fellow Argonauts, he felt a sense of pride not in his speed, but in his role as part of the team. For the first time in his journey, he understood that heroism wasn't just about the individual. It was about working together and accepting the strength that came from the unity of the group. After the Golden Fleece was secured and the dragon defeated, the Argonauts began their journey back home, their mission accomplished. The fleece, the symbol of divine power, had been reclaimed. The winds of fortune now seemed to blow favourably for the heroes, and their triumph was undeniable. However, for Zetes, the true victory had already been won long before the fleece was placed safely in their hands. It was in those final moments when the group stood victorious after overcoming their greatest challenges that Zetes realized something profound. He had grown, not just as a hero, but as a person. No longer did he view the world through the lens of speed and flight alone. He understood now that heroism wasn't just about quick reflexes or outdistancing others. It was about working with others, understanding when to act alone and when to support. During their return journey, Zets had taken a more active role in making decisions alongside Jason and the rest of the Argonauts. He had earned their respect not just through his abilities, but through his ability to adapt and see the bigger picture. When the group faced dangerous waters or encountered monsters on their way home, Zetes used his flying abilities to scout ahead, yes, but he also consulted with the group. He was no longer the one who rushed ahead in a storm of wind and reckless speed. Instead, he was a crucial part of the team, advising, strategizing, and providing solutions rather than just charging in head first. One of the key moments of Zetes' transformation came when the Argonauts encountered the Sirens, the temptresses, whose songs could lead sailors to their doom. Many heroes had fallen victim to their bewitching melodies, but Zetes, now more attuned to his limitations and the strength of the group, suggested a different tactic. Instead of rushing ahead to fight the Sirens, he he recommended that they focus on blocking out their song, using the skills of Orpheus, the group's musician. The team, led by Orpheus, played their own music, so powerful that it drowned out the siren's seductive calls. Zetes, whose flying speed had often been his solution to every problem, now understood that sometimes wisdom and strategy were more powerful than speed alone. As they sailed back, Zetes spent more time reflecting on his role within the Argonauts, his wings no longer merely a tool for escape or conquest, but part of a more balanced approach to heroism. He had learned that the journey wasn't just about reaching the destination. It was about the growth and connections made along the way. He had at last accepted that he couldn't fly away from the consequences of his past choices. Yet, despite his internal transformation, Zetes still faced a poignant realization. The Argonauts were not invincible, and no matter how much he had learned, there were still forces beyond his control. The gods, who had helped them to success, would not be content to let the heroes return to their homes without one last trial. As the crew neared their destination, the winds shifted once more, and Zetes could feel that their journey was far from over. He understood now that no matter how much he had learned, the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. Zetes' role in the Argonauts' quest was not only pivotal in the physical sense, but also in terms of the team's emotional growth. His transformation from the reckless, speed-driven hero to a strategic, team-oriented figure mirrored the group's collective maturation. Zetes had come to realize that the real strength of a hero is not in how fast they can act, but in how well they can adapt to the needs of their team and the situation at hand. In the aftermath of the Golden Fleece's return to Iolcus, Zetes was no longer remembered simply for his winged speed. He was celebrated for his wisdom, humility, and dedication to the team. His legacy, like that of many of the Argonauts, was one of growth, balance, and the understanding that heroism was not just about victories, but also about how one learns from their flaws. When the Argonauts finally returned to Iolcus, the city that had sent them on their legendary quest for the Golden Fleece, they were met with a hero's welcome. Songs were sung, feasts were held, and the Golden Fleece was placed in its rightful place, a symbol of victory over both mortal and divine challenges. Jason and Medea, as the masterminds behind the quest, were naturally celebrated, but in the aftermath of their victory, something important was also recognized. The true heroes of the journey were not just those with the loudest weapons or the most impressive feats. They were also the ones who had learned from their mistakes and adapted to the challenges in front of them. Among these heroes was Zetes. No longer the reckless, fast-flying warrior who relied solely on his speed, Zetes had evolved into a more self-aware, collaborative hero. His ability to fly, once his defining trait, had transformed into just one piece of his character. He had learned that acting with the team, using his strengths to support others rather than charging in alone, made him a more powerful ally. His impulsive nature, once a liability, had been tempered by the wisdom he gained on his journey, and this made him all the more valuable to the Argonauts. While Zetes' name wasn't sung as often as Heracles' or Jason's, it was still spoken with respect. He had been one of the unsung heroes of the quest, not because of a lack of power, but because his strength lay in his ability to adapt and support his teammates when they needed him most. His legacy wasn't about winning battles or defeating monsters. It was about learning to slow down when the moment called for it, to think before acting, and to understand that true heroism was often more about patience and teamwork than rushing into things head first. As the Argonauts went their separate ways, Zetes returned to Thrace, where he became a figure of wisdom in his own right. He was not just the son of Boreas, he was a man who had lived through the trials of the quest, who had experienced firsthand the consequences of unchecked speed and impulse. His wisdom became known far and wide, and he was often called upon by other heroes for counsel, particularly in matters of strategy, teamwork and self-discipline. In the years that followed, Zetes became a mentor to the younger generation of heroes, teaching them that the path to greatness wasn't always about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about learning from mistakes, embracing your strengths, and knowing when to act as part of a team. He wasn't a god or a demigod, but his story lived on as an example of how humility and self-awareness could elevate a hero beyond the surface level of glory and strength. Even the gods, who had once tested him with their trials, came to respect Zetes in their own way. Zeus, the king of the gods, watched from his throne as Zetes matured into a true hero. Not through divine favour, but through the choices he made. Zetes had learned the ultimate lesson. Speed and strength were only part of the story. The gods had gifted him wings, but it was his choice to grow, to learn, and to adapt that made him truly legendary. The story of Philoctetes is one of those classic cases of heroism that seems to go horribly wrong, and yet in the end works out in the most unexpected way. Philoctetes, born to the warrior Poias, was one of those rare heroes whose archery skills were so exceptional that even Heracles, yes, the demigod who literally wrestled lions, slew hydras and stopped rivers, decided, you know what, this guy should carry my bow. And so, the legendary Heracles' bow was passed to Philoctetes, making him the ultimate marksman of his time. With his ability to shoot with incredible accuracy, he could have probably hit a bullseye from 100 yards away, while blindfolded, standing on one foot and juggling flaming torches. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the point. Everything seemed to be going great for Philoctetes. He had the best bow, a future filled with legendary battles, and a chance to make a name for himself as a key figure in the Trojan War. But, as the ancient Greeks liked to remind everyone, life had a habit of throwing a curveball. While on the way to Troy, things took a nasty turn when Philoctetes was bitten by a snake on the island of Lemnos. And not just any snake. This one had a venom that caused a horrendous infection. To top it all off, the wound began to smell so terrible that even the most seasoned warriors began to wonder if it was worse than a centaur's gym locker room. Naturally, being the compassionate heroes they were, the Greeks decided the best course of action was to abandon Philoctetes on the island. Their reasoning? We can't deal with the stench. Let's just leave him there and move on. Now that's some real heroic behaviour, right? Leave the guy who's carrying Heracles' bow, the one thing that could win the war, stranded in the middle of nowhere because, well, he smells bad. Classic. But Philoctetes wasn't one to be defeated so easily. He survived on Lemnos for nearly a decade, living alone with only his bow and his frustration. Through all the pain and loneliness, he clung to his weapon, perfecting his skill, and secretly plotting the day he'd finally make those who abandoned him wish they hadn't. Maybe they were getting some karma in their future. After all, who leaves a guy with a magic bow on an island? Bad move, Greeks. Bad move. After Philoctetes had been abandoned on Lemnos for years, living in isolation, nursing a horrible snake bite, and developing a deep distrust for anyone who didn't bring a bottle of air freshener, the Greeks realised something important. They needed him. Why? Well, it turns out that the whole Trojan War thing wasn't going as smoothly as they'd hoped. The prophecy was clear. The war would not end without Heracles' bow. And guess who had that magical weapon? That's right, the very archer they had ditched. Funny how that works out, isn't it? So after much soul-searching, and probably a lot of awkward meetings with the Greek leaders, the Greeks sent Odysseus and Diomedes to Lemnos to bring Philoctetes back into the fold. Now, you'd think that after all that time they might show up with a big apology cake or a grand gesture, but no, they basically just knocked on his door and said, "Hey, we need that bow. Want to come back to Troy? We promise not to leave you alone this time." Philoctetes was understandably not impressed. After all, they had abandoned him for years with only his bow and painful memories as companions. So when Odysseus and Diomedes arrived to ask for his help, Philoctetes didn't immediately jump at the chance to help the Greeks win the war. Instead, he gave them a hearty lecture on how betrayal stinks, and not just in the literal sense. "You left me here," he said, shaking his head. "Left me alone for years to rot on an island, with nothing but this stinking wound and my bow. And now, you come here asking for my help. No apology, no sorry for abandoning you, just a, hey, can you help us win the war?" But of course, even Philoctetes, with all his anger and resentment, knew that the Trojan War was the most important thing happening in the world. He had spent years thinking about this moment. Could he hold a grudge forever? Could he really sit this one out and let the Greeks flounder without him? The decision was tough, but after a good bit of grumbling and probably a lot of thinking, Philoctetes agreed to return with Odysseus and Diomedes, ready to join the Greeks once more, under one condition. If they wanted him back, they had to promise that they would never leave him behind again, no matter how bad the situation got. No more islands, no more betrayals, no more suffering alone. If they wanted Heracles' bow, they had to accept Philoctetes in all his glory and in all his stinky, bitter, heroic splendour. Once he rejoined the Greek army, it didn't take long for Philoctetes to prove that he was more than just the guy who had been abandoned. He was the hero who had helped turn the tide of the war. His bow, which had been left behind all those years ago, was now the weapon that ultimately led to the downfall of Troy. Philoctetes' skill with the bow was unmatched. When the moment came to strike, it was Philoctetes' arrow that killed Paris, the Prince of Troy, fulfilling the prophecy and marking the end of the war. In a way, the Greeks had no one to blame but themselves for waiting so long to call on Philoctetes. But the irony of his return wasn't lost on anyone. Philoctetes had been the hero they couldn't live without, but only after they had left him behind for so long. His ultimate victory was just as much about forgiving the Greeks for their betrayal as it was about exacting revenge on the Trojan forces. Returning to the Greek army was no easy feat for Philoctetes. Though the Greeks had begged him to come back, and he had agreed, eventually his heart was still heavy with years of betrayal and suffering. The Greek army was, in many ways, the same group of people who had abandoned him on the island of Lemnos, leaving him to endure his wound and isolation for nearly a decade. Sure, they came with promises and apologies, but how could Philoctetes easily forget what they had done to him? When Philoctetes first rejoined the ranks of the Greek army, he couldn't help but feel like a shadow of his former self. Yes, he still had Heracles' bow, the weapon that would bring the Greeks their victory, but something had changed inside him. The old Philoctetes, the one who was full of fire and vengeance, was now replaced by a more thoughtful and hesitant version of the warrior. Every time he looked at his comrades, he couldn't help but wonder, did they truly see him as a hero again, or just a convenient weapon to win the war? His anger wasn't just aimed at the Greeks, it was also directed inward. The years on Lemnos had changed him. He had endured more than most heroes, and in his solitude, he had reflected on his own identity and his place in the larger world. Now that he was back among the very people who had once discarded him, Philoctetes struggled with feelings of worthlessness and doubt. Was he just a pawn in a larger game of war, or was his place in the world more meaningful than the betrayal that had defined so much of his life? As the Greek forces prepared for another attack on Troy, Philoctetes' role became clearer. The warriors were desperate. The battle needed Heracles' bow, and only Philoctetes could wield it. Yet even as he took up the legendary weapon once again, he couldn't shake the feeling of being used. This wasn't the glorious return he had imagined. It wasn't a triumph of heroism, but rather a forced reconciliation with those who had betrayed him. He had been the forgotten hero, but now, just as he had predicted, they wanted him back to solve their problems. Philoctetes knew that he couldn't simply forget the years of suffering and isolation. How could he forgive them so easily? The final test of his internal struggle came during the Trojan War's most critical moment, the battle against Paris, the Prince of Troy. The Greek prophecy had been clear. The war would end when Paris was slain by the arrow of Heracles' bow, and now Philoctetes stood poised to fulfill that prophecy. But as he drew the bowstring back and aimed at Paris, Philoctetes paused. The entire Trojan War had been defined by betrayals, deceit, and loss. Philoctetes had been abandoned by his comrades, and he had come to resent the very gods who had allowed his suffering to continue. And now, the moment had come. He could end it all. But as he stood there, poised to strike, something within him hesitated. Was this his moment for redemption? Or was he still in some way simply the hero who was summoned only when needed? In that moment, Philoctetes understood something profound. True heroism wasn't about individual glory, nor was it about seeking revenge on those who had wronged him. It was about purpose, about fulfilling a greater role in the world, despite the suffering and pain that had come before. He had the power to end the war, and in doing so he could bring peace to his people, even if it meant sacrificing the bitterness he still held. With that realization, Philoctetes released the arrow. The shot was true. Paris fell, and the Trojan War came to its fated conclusion. In that moment, Philoctetes was no longer the man left behind. He was the hero who fulfilled his destiny. The very bow that had been gifted by Heracles now fulfilled its purpose, bringing an end to the war and securing Philoctetes' place in the annals of Greek myth. After the Trojan War ended and the Greeks returned to their homes, Philoctetes' role in the fall of Troy became a symbol not only of victory, but of personal resilience and forgiveness. His actions during the final stages of the war proved that heroism was not just about battle prowess, but also about understanding the cost of war and the importance of reconciliation. Though Philoctetes had been betrayed by the Greeks, his return to the fold and his role in the death of Paris had a profound effect on the Greek army. The story of his suffering on Lemnos and his forgiveness of those who had abandoned him became a powerful narrative. It served as a reminder that a true hero doesn't simply conquer enemies in battle, but also conquers their own inner struggles, overcoming the pain of betrayal and transforming it into something greater. Back in Thrace, where Philoctetes made his home, the hero was celebrated not just for his role in ending the Trojan War, but for the wisdom he brought back with him. The time he spent alone on Lemnos had given him a rare perspective on life, heroism, and humanity. Instead of seeking endless glory or revenge, Philoctetes became a figure of humility and leadership, teaching those who sought him out that the true path of a hero was not defined by endless conquest, but by the strength to forgive and the courage to rise above the past. Diomedes, one of the greatest warriors of the Trojan War, often sought Philoctetes' counsel, admiring the way Philoctetes had overcome such personal agony to become a hero of such magnitude. Though Diomedes himself had grown into a leader of the Greeks, he respected Philoctetes' approach to leadership, which was not about commanding with strength, but about understanding when to act and when to rely on others. Over time, Philoctetes became a symbol for many heroes who would follow in his footsteps. His story was told far and wide, not just for the way he had helped bring down Troy, but for the personal journey he had endured. Heroes like Achilles, Odysseus, and Nestor, all of whom had their own complicated relationships with the gods and fate, saw in Philoctetes a reflection of their own struggles. They saw that a hero was not just a warrior, but a person who could rise above pain, forgive those who wronged them, and find the strength to continue, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Philoctetes' journey was not just about fighting in the Trojan War or defeating enemies. It was about the emotional battle that came with the warrior's life, the cost of betrayal, the pain of abandonment, and the burden of isolation. He became the living embodiment of what it meant to be a hero, who was tested by the most difficult challenges, not just in the physical world, but in the inner world of forgiveness, acceptance, and redemption. The impact of Philoctetes' story was also felt in how heroes viewed their relationship with the gods. Though Philoctetes had been abandoned by the Greeks and left to suffer on Lemnos, he had never turned his back on the gods. In fact, his ultimate victory was a testament to his understanding that strength came not from individual might, but from the divine connection he had maintained despite his suffering. His bow, a gift from Heracles, was an artifact of the gods, but it was Philoctetes' character, his willingness to forgive, and his inner strength that made him the true hero. When the younger generations of heroes looked to Philoctetes, they saw him as an example of grit and grace under pressure. His name became synonymous with the idea that true heroism didn't mean always fighting for glory. It meant understanding your place in the world, embracing your weaknesses, and knowing when to act for the greater good. In the later years of his life, Philoctetes became more than just a war hero. He was a mentor, a figure to whom other heroes came for advice, not on how to swing a sword, but on how to navigate life's trials. It was not the bloodied victories that defined him, but the moral victory he had earned over his own suffering. He showed that a hero could be someone who faced both external battles and inner struggles, and that true strength lay in overcoming not just the enemy in front of you, but the enemy within. The legacy of Philoctetes was one of transformation, showing that heroism was not a fixed state. It was a journey. It was a path of redemption, of overcoming pain and forgiving those who wronged you, and of realizing that even in the most difficult times, a hero's purpose could be greater than individual glory.